Okay, I'm going to try and not be too boring. Tax, we know, is something that's going to happen, but one thing that's in the press at the moment is offshore jurisdictions. I think we know that the new rules on beneficial ownership declarations for the British overseas territories are coming in, whether they like them or not. It seems to be the new way that the UK Parliament is dealing with the British overseas territories, and even the Crown dependencies, Jersey, Guernsey, etc., are looking like they're going to have to fall in as well. Now, that's going to be one of the big issues that we see going forward for international families, because traditionally offshore it's been tax neutral. It's a very easy way of setting up to make sure your investments are as well planned as they possibly can. And I think what we can see from the UK government at least is the idea that anyone using it for privacy purposes is no longer going to be helped by going there. One of the things that the offshore territories are railing about, of course, is that this is based on the lie that they are just there to facilitate tax evasion. As I said last year at this conference, the media has carried out a great campaign, and has been very successful at basically smearing the reputations of some very highly regulated jurisdictions like Jersey and Guernsey. And most offshore jurisdictions are certainly further ahead than onshore jurisdictions in relation to anti-money laundering and know your client due diligence. So it comes down to the question, will anyone be using offshore jurisdictions? And I think it has to be on the basis that you have to be well advised, you have to understand that there is a potential reputation risk. You may have no problems yourself. We've seen this in the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, but someone who uses the same company and corporation agent as you isn't quite so well-heeled, and therefore you could be dragged into a mire if you use offshore jurisdictions. However, privacy is not their only benefit, and a tax transparent jurisdiction, I think, does have its place. It just means that you're going to have to be super aware, well advised, and understand your position. We've also got the added issue of CRS and FATCA. It's interesting at the moment because the offshore jurisdictions are trying to argue against what's coming in, because simply speaking, this declaration of public ownership is not being enforced through the rest of the world. I think pretty much we know that Delaware is a very attractive jurisdiction all of a sudden, and a lot of companies are being formed there on the back of this. Across Europe, you've got Luxembourg, you've got Malta, you've got other jurisdictions that have some form of ability to defer taxes or minimise them, and yet they're not going through the same process as of yet. It will be interesting to see if this gets adopted worldwide, but we are obviously front runners in this. And of course that brings us to the question, is this the death of privacy for offshore jurisdictions? And if it is, we've got to ask the question, does it matter? If you're using an offshore jurisdiction properly, where you're well advised, you're paying the right amount of tax in your home jurisdiction, I think you've got to query whether anyone is worried about privacy anymore. Once we get the first big data explosion from CRS and FATCA, I think we're far more likely to see issues arising onshore which are unforeseen. And I'm quite looking forward to seeing how that's going to be dealt with in the media. I think one of the second things we need to talk about by way of update is certain new rules that have come into the UK. They're rather draconian in nature, and it's part of our campaign to look whiter than white in respect of the world's wealth. We only want good money here. The reality is there's been lots of arguments that PEPs and criminals have been buying up property in London with proceeds of crime, and effectively this is a piece of legislation that's come in to address that, and it's really a grab for assets that are owned in a way that is unexplained. So it is effectively in relation to assets worth over £50,000. It applies to politically exposed persons or someone who is suspected of committed a serious crime, such as tax evasion. It's open to this procedure is effectively a way of enforcing a statement from an individual or an owner of said property to say, how did you own it? How did you come to buy it? And if you cannot explain how you came to buy that asset can be taken from you. It has already been used. I think there is a Far Eastern politician who has lost about £22 million worth of UK real estate. So it's something that's already in play. I think for most people who aren't PEPs, they might think, well, that's not a problem for me. But one of the issues is the tax evasion point. It may be that, because if this is open to HMRC, it's not just open to sort of the FCA and serious crime, etc. From that, of course, they get a lot of information from whoever owns the property, and that may then lead into other questions that they can use in other areas of investigation. So it's also going to be an information tool. And I think anyone coming to the UK now, regardless of who they are, regardless of how they've made their money, I think in the same way that we always advise you should do a domicile statement when you come to the UK, I think you should now consider doing a wealth statement. You've virtually got to do them for the banks anyway, so it's just an extension of that to explain where the money comes from, where your source of wealth sits. And this, it doesn't go anywhere. You put it into the file with your lawyers, and it sits there until a question is asked. At least then, once a question is asked, you're almost into an inquiry regime. The difference, however, with this inquiry regime is the burden of proof is reversed. Now, don't forget I said at the beginning of this was in relation to suspicion. So it doesn't matter that you haven't committed a crime, you're not guilty of it. If there's suspicion of it, the burden of proof is on you to prove that you have correctly got your money together to buy that property from genuine, proper sources. And that's quite a draconian thing to do when there would have been no finding of fact, no finding of law. There must be a human rights argument, I would say. Of course, in the situation we're in at the moment, we have to accept that the law and everything is being driven by a media campaign. In terms of other things you need to think about at the moment, international law is becoming very interesting, especially for international private client families, in that we are starting to see arguments over double tax treaties. And a lot of international planning is based around double tax treaties. The whole point of the BEPS legislation was to stop profit shifting or to make it only available to legitimately set up companies with substance in particular jurisdictions. But of course the offset of that is that people are now seeing via CRS and FATCA money flows, and that includes the governments who can see tax flows as well. So I can imagine over the next few years, family offices are going to have to review how their businesses and how their personal planning works, especially with lending, across the pivotal jurisdictions in Europe of Luxembourg and Switzerland, because I think their tax treaties are going to be up for grabs, and certainly I can see Germany becoming much harsher in the way that it views things, and I think there's been a couple of countries that are already talking about pulling their treaties with Luxembourg. So that's a very swift run through things that we're seeing at the moment, and I'm going to hand over to Charles now to talk about immigration.